right, so here we are. This is week 4. Last week we talked about, we started talking about the flood of Noah, and we spoke a lot about the geology and such, and we talked about what happened to the earth itself and how it was really resurfaced from what it was originally to what we know now today. And we kind of talked a little bit about how you could probably go see some of this stuff, and I just wanted to point out, I didn't make it very clear, but actually most of those pictures we were looking at were pictures that I took when we traveled last year, and so I would encourage you to, if you're going to travel out west, think about this stuff ahead of time, get to know what you're looking at, because once we went out there, it really became clear that everywhere we went, there was just abundant evidence of the flood, because I had learned ahead of time what to look for. Yeah, so as we were traveling there, like this is an example, right? So everywhere we went, this is us in Death Valley, and what you see here is we're standing in what they call a canyon, under what they call an arch. And this is fascinating, because what you see in the walls here is all dried mud with little rocks in it. And this arch here, everybody goes up there and takes this big hike up the wash, and people stand under it to get their picture taken, and I have to admit I wouldn't stand under it, because on our way up the wash, we'd passed a section where the wall had collapsed, and it was very obvious that this is not even rock, this is just dried mud, okay? So again, how does that happen? So here we have kind of a close-up, and you can see it's just, there's all these little rocks suspended in all this mud, right? And under that arch, there were all these big cracks running through the dried mud arch. And then they were talking about on the signs, it's like, oh, this is 30-some tons of dried mud. I'm like, yeah, we're not standing under that. But just to show you, this was part of the ball that fell off. Yeah. So how does that get there, right? Anyway, so everywhere you go out west, where there's this big erosive features, you get to look down into the earth, and there's so much evidence there. All right, so this week we're going to talk mostly about paleontology as far as our science topic, and I'll say it's really just all about fossils this week. But what we're talking about, instead of what happened to the world, we're talking about what happened to the living things. And this will kind of wrap up our time with the flood, and next week we're going to move on to other things. But, so, this is 2 Peter 3, and Peter really encourages us to remember this, right? He encourages us to remember the flood, because there are those, as he says, in the last days who will forget. And so we remember that the world was deluged with water and perished, and we're going to talk about why at the end. So, the judgment of the flood. And we really want to focus this week on why the flood was a judgment, and what the evidence is that it was a judgment that God declared, because absolute corruption had overtaken his creation. And so we see this here in Genesis 6. If you want to turn there and follow along, I'm just going to walk us through our scriptures this week, partly for emphasis and partly for time. But the Lord saw, Genesis 6:5, that human wickedness was widespread on the earth, and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was deeply grieved. Then the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I created, off the face of the earth, together with the animals, creatures that crawl, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. And later in the chapter, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with wickedness. God saw how corrupt the earth was, for every creature had corrupted its way on the earth. Then God said, no, I have decided to put an end to every creature, for the earth is filled with wickedness because of them. Therefore, I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. So, did this happen? I think we're going to see this week that it did. So, what we commonly call the fossil record is really its remains of plants and animals, and they're preserved in sedimentary layers that we talked about extensively last week. And so we're going to look now at what is in this fossil record and see that God has left this record for us. You see, we see in the fossil record, and we talked a little bit alluding to this, this is at Petrified Forest National Park, which we see that these giant forests of conifer trees were wiped out. You see these trees here, and you see here every one of these is a piece of tree trunk here. Massive, massive trees. And if we look, what's happening here is all of these petrified trees are suspended in a combination of mud and volcanic ash. And what's happening is, as it rains occasionally, this is washing away. And these little tree trunks here are laying inside the sediment, and as the sediments are washed away, they kind of stick out from the cliff face that's resulting, and they eventually break off when they're too heavy, and they roll down, and they land down below. And again, you can see here, like every one of these that looks like a rock, that's a tree trunk. Okay? And this goes on for miles and miles. In fact, inside the park, there's 146 square miles of petrified forests. That's about 20% of the petrified wood in this area of Arizona. Okay? And this deposit is about 2,000 feet thick. So the conventional story is there was a little river that wandered through here, and the trees would build up. That's what you'll read on the park sign. I'll tell you, I think that's probably not enough to explain this, considering its extent. And it's just, it's everywhere. And these, I mean, they even look still like trees, even though they're becoming petrified. But they're not all the way petrified. In fact, we learned while we were there that a lot of times we have the original cellular structure, and even the protein called lignin that grows in trees is still in there. So they're not even all the way rock yet as they're washing out. In addition, shout out for West Virginia here, we see these immense coal deposits, right? We saw some of this lycopod bark here before. That's what we find in coal. In fact, we now know that from some of the studies that went on after Mount St. Helens erupted, that coal is almost certainly formed by deposition of tree bark from logs that are floating on the surface of water. As they float, they rub and rotate and bang into each other. The bark falls off first, years ahead of time, before the logs actually sink. And the bark all accumulates in a big mat. And then you get another eruption, for example, in the case of Mount St. Helens, comes through, buries that mat several feet thick of tree bark. And so eventually that will be coal. Probably, I mean, there's theories that if we dug under the lake now, we'd find coal already from Mount St. Helens, which erupted in 1980. But we see this as evidence then, if you can imagine, this is a log mat in a lake at Mount St. Helens, we see the size of these coal seams, and we just talked about the size of the forest of trees that are buried. And what that suggests to us is that this was a significantly bigger event, of course, that caused what we know as coal seams. So we also see billions of dead things buried inside those sedimentary layers that we talked so much about last week. And it's important to remember when we look at fossils like this, we remember that this is essentially a snapshot in time, right? This is all of these things that are buried here were alive around the same time, and they were all buried around the same event, right? So this is like what the plants and animals were like at the start of the flood, and these are the things that were buried over that year. These pictures are from Dinosaur National Monument. An interesting story, we arrived there to look at the dinosaurs like everyone does, and when we got there, I talked to one of the rangers that was sitting there as we're walking into this monument that's encased in this building. I said, what else do we find in here besides dinosaurs? And he says, yeah, I don't know that we find anything else. I said, oh, okay. So I wandered around and I read the signs, and here's what we find mixed in with the dinosaurs. We see these large sauropods, of course, we see stegosaurs, and we see allosaurs, and then we see turtles and crocodiles, small lizards, rodents, beetles, termites, fish, clams, frogs, salamanders, and snails. So, we miss something if we are solely focused on the exciting stuff, because we miss that these dinosaurs are mixed with all kinds of modern animals you might actually recognize. So this one here, this is a smaller sauropod dinosaur called a Camarasaurus, and this is a pose that we find most of these animals in. This is called a Opisthotonus, if you're interested. But it was a kind of a phenomenon that baffled scientists for a number of years, because they didn't really have a good explanation for how this happened. But back in 2011, scientists by the name of Alicia Cutler of Brigham Young University found that this posture occurs when animals are submerged in water at death. You see, what we also find here, and this is the conventional paradigm, as we'll say, that the fossils that are found alongside all of the buried organisms that we see are all sea creatures. There's sea creatures in every sedimentary layer, even on the top of the highest mountains. We see here is a shrimp, some fish, right? But this is a place in Chile called Cerro Molina, and this is they were building a highway through these mountain passes at an elevation of 8,000 feet, and they found 40 fossilized whales at 8,000 feet elevation. So we see sea creatures of all kinds, even on the top of these highest mountains. But wait, you say, aren't fossils really old? I'm going to show you a video clip here, and it's pretty gross. So if you don't want to see something gross, now's the time to read Genesis 6. Okay? All right, so what we have here is a deer. And really the point of this, we want to understand whether the fossils are old. So first, we have to discuss, what makes a fossil. You see, we kind of actually know from experience that most dead things don't make fossils, right? And this is kind of the normal process of decomposition that occurs. And this happens pretty much whenever an animal dies now. And it may be gross, but this video, you should know, this deer was actually placed inside a fence to try to limit access to scavengers. So it's a little bit artificially slow, if you will. But what we learn by watching this is that it takes a very special set of circumstances for a fossil to form at all. So this entire deer is gone in about 5 days. You can see some birds coming in and repositioning it. So here we go. Day 5, and we're almost completely gone here. So that's the normal thing that happens when animals die. So again, the question, how do fossils form? Well, you were probably taught something like this in school, right? Where the animal dies and then everything rots away with the bones and they lay there for a long time, and then maybe at some point they get buried, and then maybe after that, lots of time goes by and minerals seep into the bones with water, and then eventually, we dig them up today. Right? I mean, did you hear that before? Somebody heard that before? Okay. So, is that true? You see, we saw that deer broken down in just days, and the skeleton even started getting pulled apart. So bony skeleton usually only lasts about 1 to 2 months before no trace of the animal could be found. So unfortunately, not this several million year process. We've been told, in fact, secular science is starting to finally catch up on this. And they're admitting this, and then hopefully start to change some textbooks, because we know that you need rapid and catastrophic burial, as we see here from the British Geological Society. Right? The burial process has to be quick so that it isolates the body from scavengers and other processes. And then notice here that actually it has to be buried in sediments suspended in water. So that's how fossils form, buried quickly, suspended in waterborne sediments. How quickly do fossils form? I mean, millions of years, right? Is that what that, yeah. Oh, no, actually. So in July of 2018, there was an experiment done where we can simulate the process of fossilization in the lab in 24 hours. We can fossilize these things. So, appropriately buried with the right heat and pressure, and we can create fossils that, in this study, were indistinguishable from the real thing. So, fossils form quickly. Well, how quickly then were the fossils that we see buried? See, this is a rather famous fossil now, but this, backing up the conclusions of the British Geological Society, we know that these fossils were buried rapidly because this mammal fighting a dinosaur were buried in mid-fight. You can see here, this is a mammal that's got its jaws on the foreleg of this dinosaur. You can see a claw on its mouth here. Yeah, they're mid-fight when they get buried. So, not a normal death process here, right? What else? Well, we see this fish buried mid-meal, right? And it's not like we just have a single example of this. We see this over and over. I didn't have time to finish swallowing. This is a famous ichthyosaur fossil. And as far as we can tell, it was buried mid-birth. See the baby here? So how quickly were fossils buried? So this, then how long, if fossils have to be buried quickly, and it doesn't take very long to make one, how long does it take to make one of these layers of rock? Well, so conventionally this is probably around 300-400 million years of sediment here that this tree was standing and getting buried slowly. I mean, wait a minute. That doesn't make any sense, right? These trees clearly extend through multiple kinds of geologic layers. In fact, some of these extend through shale, coal, and sandstone, all in one tree trunk. And so, if these were buried as they stood in place, you think that maybe they would have, I don't know, rotted or something, right? In fact, it gets real weird when we see some of these trees are buried upside down with their roots in the air. How does this happen? Remember that picture of Mount St. Helens and the logs floating on the lake as they float there they've been there for a few decades now. But they are exponentially sinking to the bottom at this point. And as they get waterlogged, they sink down, and most of them do land roots down. Some of them will land roots up, and a few of them do land on their side. So we're kind of talking about how fossils are made. What's in the fossil record, right? Like, this is probably what you imagine. That's not a real fossil, that's fake. But, right, these terrifying Jurassic Park dinosaurs, right? Well, the truth is that 95% of fossils are marine fossils, meaning from the ocean. Most of them are invertebrates like this, or like this, or like this. This is called a crinoid. Or like this, right? So, of the remaining 5% of all fossils that are not marine organisms, most are plants. Less than 1% of fossils found are land animals. We do find extinct species, right? We've been talking about some, but we also see many creatures that are exactly the same as modern animals. And so let's look at a few examples of that. So this is a fish called a coelacanth. And originally it was only known from the fossil record. And in fact, evolutionists once championed this as evidence of a fish starting to grow feet. I guess because of the bone structure in the fins here. And they claimed it lived from 360 million years ago up until about 65 million years ago when it went extinct. Oops. Actually, they live off the coast of Africa and Indonesia. As you can see, those are thoroughly modern divers getting a picture taken with this fish. You see, this is in fact only just one example of a species that we see today that's entirely unchanged from its fossils. Like this horseshoe crab. I love this one, that the horseshoe crab was walking along when it got buried. These are brittle stars, a type of sea star. Sand dollars, this is one you would find on the beach. These are fossilized sand dollars. Crab here, if you can see this split apart rock and the crab is inside it here. Here's some shrimp. I mean, they're shrimp, right? Several of these fossils were actually for sale in a shop in Moab, Utah. Here's some dragonflies. Here's a tortoise, a whole fossilized tortoise. And here's my daughter Abby with a tortoise. Here's a bat. Here is a rabbit. Harder to recognize because the ears, of course, don't fossilize. This is a lemur. And this is actually, this picture here is from the National Park Service website where they're talking about, they have an article about fossilized mammals. They don't actually talk about the fish laying here next to this lemur, but nor about all these fish around this fossilized horse either. It's a small horse, but nonetheless a horse. So, what's in the fossil record? Well, mostly ocean creatures and lots of things that you would recognize if it was walking around today. So what were we taught that dinosaur fossils were made of? Anybody?
Their bones.
Their bones, yeah. What happens to their bones? Are they bones just in the ground? What do you got? Go ahead. They turn into rocks. Yeah, we were taught that in school, right? That their bones have turned into rocks. Well, let's see this clip here.
What is this material that Dr. Schweitzer found inside a dinosaur bone in 2005? Why was it reported on 60 Minutes, NBC News, BBC, and other news outlets around the world? When she first tried to publish this dinosaur soft tissue discovery in science journals, why did some reviewers refuse to publish her findings, stating that they were impossible and that no amount of evidence would convince them that her team really found original dinosaur tissue? And why did the scientists who excavated these bones report that the ground had a stench of death and that the odor from the bones reminded them of the smell of cadavers? Does any of this make sense if these bones are just petrified rocks that laid in the earth for over 67 million years? Surely there's a better explanation. Perhaps these bones were not buried 67 million years ago. If an enormous watery catastrophe recently buried these creatures under tens of feet of mud just thousands of years ago, could the worldwide flood described in the Bible be the correct explanation? Stay tuned to find out. Did you know that Dr. Schweitzer's mainstream discovery that hit the news in 2005 is just the tip of the iceberg? Hundreds of secular scientists from around the world have published over 120 science articles describing original biomaterials from dinosaurs and other ancient creatures throughout the geologic column since 1954. And it's not just one type of soft tissue or biochemical they're finding, but 16 different varieties, including blood vessels, red blood cells, hemoglobin, osteocytes, ovalbumin, chitin, unmineralized bone, collagen, chromosomes, skin pigments, VEX proteins, histone, keratin, and elastin. The most recent two discoveries are cartilage and even nerve cells from Triceratops. What's so amazing about these findings is that the entire paleontology field, with thousands of scientists, completely missed these original short-lived biomaterials. Why? Because they simply believed they were just hardened rocks based on their millions of years worldview.
So this has actually been extensively studied now, and so because the original response was to deny that it was correct, and then it's been studied and studied and studied and corroborated so many times, and as you saw, hundreds of published articles now in the literature about this, and so then they've gone to studying, well, goodness, I mean, these tissues are there, and we know that these things died 65 million years ago, so we should figure out how they could possibly be preserved. And so the longest lived biomolecule is collagen, okay? And it's the most durable protein, we'll say. And the longest it could possibly last, because we've got a vested interest in figuring this out, right? the longest it could possibly last under ideal laboratory conditions is 900,000 years. So that sounds like a lot, right? But the problem is that that's a little bit shorter than 65 million years. And I have to point out that most of these fossils are not found under ideal laboratory conditions. I mean, most of them are buried in areas where there's heat and cold and moisture and all kinds of things. And so if they had lasted that long, or if they were that long ago, there would be no biomaterial left. And so this leaves us with a problem, right? It's that dinosaurs couldn't possibly have died out that long ago. It's not possible, because their tissue is still with us. So, in fact, some of the really cool stuff that we've recently found. This is the skin of a hadrosaur, still intact with its original color. And then my personal favorite, this ankylosaur from a coal mine in Canada, where they were digging for coal and found this looking back at them. Can you imagine? So this thing, I mean, it's probably, I don't know, somewhere between 50 and 75% intact, but isn't that amazing? Have you ever seen anything like that? So original skin and tissues. So, aren't fossils really old? That's the question we asked, right? Are the fossils old? Well, we see the truth that science actually shows us is this. Fossils are formed when they're buried quickly. They can be formed in as little as 24 hours. They demonstrate that they were buried suddenly in the midst of their normal life activities. Some of the fossils span through many geologic layers. And let's not forget, the fossil record contains countless modern animals, in addition to the extinct species. And then, of course, lastly, soft tissue indicates that dinosaur fossils cannot be old. So, we see then that the evidence from God's judgment on the flood is abundant, right? All of these billions of things that died, as he said they would. He said he was going to wipe every creeping thing that breathes air from the face of the earth. And so we started out at the beginning, we looked at 2 Peter 3, and this is where we saw Peter referring to the world that perished with water. But he now then immediately reminds us that the current world is destined to be destroyed by fire when Jesus comes back. And in fact, if we read this whole chapter in the context, the point that Peter is making is that we should not live as if everything is continuing on as it always has, but that we should live in light of the evidence of the flood around us as though we know that Jesus is coming back. So next week, we're going to examine some of the lies that our culture has become inundated with, and indeed willingly imbibes, to keep them from feeling that judgment is coming. Okay, here's your codes if you want an electronic version, if you want to go back and review today's video. For those who are here early, we do play a bonus video. And then, of course, today's article. There's also copies of last week's article on the table as well. And that is good stuff. So the reason I do these things is because there's really no way for me to cover all of the things that there are to cover during this class. So if you're willing and interested in taking some bonus content, go for it. Slightly early. Last week we were slightly late. I guess it balances out. Let me pray, and we'll go worship together. Father God, creator of heaven and earth, We thank you that you have left your record of your judgment, that we can see that you have done what you said you would do. We know that you will do then what you say you will do in the future. Remind us this week as we live that we don't live as though everything will always continue, but we live expectantly, waiting for you to return. Lord, thank you for the chance now to go and worship together as a people, as your people. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.